Hello there. I'm Aegis. Welcome to the Thimin channel, where we explore our inner world. Here's your host, Walter.
Hey, what's going on? In the previous video, we talked about listening to yourself, that you don't need more external advice. And once you start listening to yourself, everything inside you goes still. It's the moment after the reflex to react loses its grip. It's the moment after you realize the signal you're hearing is yours. And it's strange because clarity might be expected to be loud, but it's not. It feels quiet, almost a little too quiet. Like the world is waiting to see what you're going to do next. And that's when the noise starts to fall away. The brain stops scanning for external signals and starts listening for internal ones. And inward is where recognition lives. In this absence of incoming demands, that opens your inner world that allows for reflection and long range thinking. It's the part of the brain that says, this is who I am, this is what matters. Noise suppresses it, and silence restores it. This is why silence feels like clarity, because the part of your brain that creates clarity finally has room to operate. This is the only environment where your internal world becomes louder than the external one. It gives you orientation, meaning, and direction. It's full of everything you've been carrying, but haven't had the space to hear. It's the moment before the return. It's the moment before recognition. It's the moment where the internal compass turns back on. And this is where your work, the slow burn, the quiet clarity, the mythic return actually forms. It's common to think the awakening is the breakthrough, but the real hinge, the real turning point, is what happens after the awakening. It's that first flicker of awareness where you think, okay, I hear myself again. What do I do with this? Information is only as good as the silence you give yourself to process it. And when the world inside you finally goes quiet, your thinking becomes vivid. Not because you learned something new, but because you stop drowning out what you already knew. It's the same moment Dan Greenhouse, who's a money manager in the stock market, describes when he says, reading the headlines, that the market's about to go for a downturn. Well, if it's going for a downturn, what do I do with that information? Sell? Sell everything? Wait, what if I missed the uptrend? That's the reflux. That's the noise, the headlines. That's the part of you that thinks information is a command, but awakening isn't a command. It's a mirror, a sudden ability to see yourself from a distance, catching the blind spots of, oh, I do that? And it can feel awkward, which isn't bad. It just means it has your attention. And that moment after awakening is the first time you realize it. It's not a high, it's a shift in perception. And it's key to maintain this awareness, to observe without judgment, so the sting and defensiveness fades away, that you can start to see what no longer serves you. There's a lot of lumpiness involved, but eventually you find your footing, you find your way. And when the noise falls away, your old reflexes don't disappear. They just lose their agency. You still feel the pull to act quickly, to fix something, to optimize, to get ahead of the curve. But now something in you pauses. Not because you're trying to be calm, not because you're trying to be wise, but because The signal you're hearing doesn't demand action. It simply invites attention. And that can feel new, that's unfamiliar. And that's the beginning of orientation. And with that, you get acclimated to things unfolding, to notice the pattern, to make connections so you can gauge what could happen next. And it's not so much to predict the future, to feel good about it, making a great call, but it's to be prepared for what might arise. To the point of Dan Greenhouse comments about the market headed for a downturn. Yes, eventually, there will be one, as there always is, but that could be 2 to 5 years out. No one really knows that. But instead, it's applying these concepts where you can start to prepare mentally, incrementally, of when it does unfold, mapping out what you would do. And with that, you're less likely to panic, being able to navigate the turbulence. And then in this moment, a quiet question arises, you know, not from fear, not from pressure, but from instinct. What does this mean for me? Not what should I do? What's the right move? What's the strategy? Just what does this mean for me? The question is a doorway. It's the first sign that your internal compass is turning back on. It's curiosity, not compliance. And curiosity is the first sign of the return, where something meaningful is happening here. It's soft, it's instinctive, and non directive. It doesn't tell you what to do, it simply pulls your attention inward. This can spark initiative, which is responding to what curiosity revealed. The moment you want to move differently with conviction, to go with what feels right to you, where you're not looking around to see if anyone agrees. Initiative is not willpower, it's recognition in motion. It's the natural next step once you see, yourself clearly enough that doing the same thing becomes impossible. Curiosity is the moment you see yourself, and initiative is the movement you have because of what you saw. When you hear your own signal again, it doesn't feel like new information. It just feels like something familiar tugging at you from a distance. Like the stars pulling at Simba, like Nala recognizing him before he recognizes himself, like Rafiki provoking him with a truth he already knows. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not motivational. It's a pull, a pull towards something you used to know, something you used to feel, something you used to trust. And you don't chase it, you simply follow it. And there's a difference. I like to think of it like birds having the urge to fly south for the winter. Their instincts tell them to fly, but without someone showing them where to fly to, they just fly somewhere, not knowing if they're headed in the direction that they need to. And listening to yourself is exactly that, showing you where to fly to. When you awaken, you feel the urge to move, the pull towards something. You feel the direction before you understand it. But without listening to yourself, the instinct has no orientation. Noise scrambles the compass, and silence restores it. Once you reach that point, there's no going back. External advice that once seemed reassuring or sensible starts to become confusing. It feels too loud, too generic, too mismatched, too prescriptive. And even if you try to go back, you won't stay there because your internal compass is active. Your system wants to fly. And this is the moment that matters. You notice you're not reacting, you're not scrambling, you're not trying to get ahead of anything. You're listening, you're observing, you're letting the signal settle inside you long enough to see what it reveals. And this is the moment where authorship begins, not with action, but with awareness. You're not trying to be someone, you're simply remembering. Here, more responses become a bit muted, that takes away the shock factor. And this allows to process things more effectively. Not every bit of information needs a reaction. Maybe just a mental note, storing it and referencing back for when you need it. It's enough to pay attention to see what potentially is ahead. And there's a shift that happens here. It's subtle, but it's unmistakable. You feel yourself moving from urgency to clarity, from reaction to recognition, from noise to signal, from external reference to internal reference. It's the small moments where this shows up, where the system is reorganizing itself, things like pausing and taking your time to respond, a shift in tone, stepping away to gather yourself. These moments don't announce themselves, they accumulate. No hype, no jargon, just truth. Truth that doesn't push you, truth that doesn't tell you what to do. It's truth that simply reveals what's already there. And this quietly builds inside steadily, without spikes or theatrics. It's a slow burn where all the subtle moments compounds. The system is becoming more coordinated and the instinct becomes sharper. It feels like internal momentum, quiet confidence, and grounded belief that becomes inevitable, where you know what you need to do. And this slow burn is what makes this lasting and integrating. And this moment, the moment after awakening, it's not the return. It's the beginning of the return. It's the moment where you realize I'm hearing myself again. And that realization, it doesn't give you a plan, but it gives you a direction, a pull, a curiosity, a sense that something inside you is waking up. And you don't need to know where it leads. You just need to recognize that it's yours. And before any visible change, before any action, or before any decision is made, this is the setup before you take off. It's the internal check to ensure you're ready for liftoff. Going through the whole checklist: noise gone, direction felt, posture shifts, breath deepens, inevitability sets in. We're on our way, just like the bird's urge to fly. You have that too. Your instincts paired with listening inward. You'll get to where you need to. It'll be messy at times, but eventually you figure it out. And the thing is, you don't need to act on the signal right away. You just need to acknowledge it. Because the moment you acknowledge it, you're no longer drifting. You're no longer outsourcing your conviction. You're no longer performing correctness. You're listening, and listening is the first act of authorship. The message you hear from yourself prepares you. It's the announcement, the verbal cue that tells the body, all right, pay attention. something irreversible is about to happen. And the movement you take convinces you. This is the taxi onto the runway, the physical cue, the subtle forward movement that makes your breathing change. The body knows we're committed now. Paying attention to the pool and following your instincts because it leads you to your directional truth. Once you decide to fly your route, it just feels so natural that it makes you wonder, I had this in me? What else can I do? And this is where you realize this was always mine. I wasn't broken, just misaligned. It's the landscape unfolding underneath you. It's the moment where instinct and environment align so well that movement becomes effortless. It looks coordinated, graceful, and purposeful. Silence doesn't just make you calm, it makes you you. It's the environment where your identity becomes audible again. And it's more than the absence of sound, it's the absence of external direction, so you got to make sure to protect it as it's your refuge. It's where vivid thinking returns. It's the moment where drift stops. It's the moment where authorship begins. So if you're in that moment after awakening, don't rush it. Avoid turning it into a plan. Avoid making it productive. Avoid optimizing it. Just notice it. Notice the quiet, notice the pull, notice the curiosity, because that curiosity, that's the beginning of your return. Follow it because it leads to initiative. And from there, the inevitable happens. I consistently retreat to silence, especially during times when it feels like it's too much for me. It resets me to filter out the distractions, gets my thinking lean and clean to start working my way through the entanglements. I don't need to have answers to the things that are pulling at me, but it really settles and organizes my thoughts. It really relieves the tension and it gives me peace of mind. Eventually, the important things don't sneak up on me because I gave it enough time to process it. Whether it's a fairly big decision or a relatively small one, they're taken well in stride. But even in the good times, I like to acknowledge things that are going well, because it reinforces that, and it just becomes more of my focus, right? Where I literally remove distractions and just tell myself, wow, I get to have this moment to enjoy. And the more that I do this, the better I feel as it eventually becomes the default. Sometimes I'll go for a walk, stare out the window, or even on my drive, be in silence and just let my mind wander. It's really amazing how decluttering naturally gives more space to operate. It's like a mini rejuvenation, feeling lighter and energized. What's your place where you hear yourself? I'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed our time with us and look forward to seeing you again real soon.